A loud bang echoed through the terminal. A man stood frozen eyes wide, watching as 3 major airlines shut down, losing millions of dollars in just a few hours. Mark Turner, CEO of Flytech Solutions, a leading aviation software company, showed no sign of shock. He stood there silently staring at the airport screen where his face suddenly appeared. The game changer of the aviation industry, that was the headline, flashing across the screen amidst the never-ending, flashing numbers of damage. It all started with a flight seat and racism disguised as a small mistake. None of the passengers on Flight 22387 knew that the man they had just pulled from first class, the man they assumed couldn't possibly be a VIP, was the one controlling all 3 of these airlines. A silent battle began the moment the flight attendant decided to judge Mark as an anonymous person, and from that moment, they couldn't have guessed that Mark Turner was the one to change it all. The airport was bustling, filled with the repetitive sounds of luggage, clattering announcements over the intercom, and the hurried footsteps of passengers. But Mark wasn't in a rush. He glanced around, absorbing the sighs of those rushing about. Suddenly he stopped in front of the information board where the flashing words, "Passenger Mark Turner," seemed to assert once more that this owner would never be overlooked. Is this how it's going to end for me? Mark wondered to himself, his eyes still fixed on the next words, flashing on the electronic board. In reality, even though he was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, even though he could control the entire global airline system, at that moment, he was still just a man being disregarded by those around him. It was a quiet kind of discrimination. Only silence hung in the air like a shadow over the spot where he stood. A glance of doubt from the flight attendant, a strange look from the check-in staff. It felt as if they were silently telling him, "You don't belong here." Mark was prepared for this. He knew from the time he was an idealistic student that he was being judged for the color of his skin. He had watched others rise while he had to scramble for the smallest opportunities. But he endured knowing that one day he would show the world that those quick judgments would come with a price. The story began when a flight attendant approached, eyeing him with distaste. She looked him up and down, lips tightly pursed, as if evaluating whether the seat he was in was worthy of him. She leaned down, skimmed through his ticket, and then checked again for a brief moment. "This seat is not for you, sir," the flight attendant said, her voice sharp. Mark was taken aback. What was she talking about? He glanced around the curious stares of the other passengers and attendants gathering behind him. What had he done wrong, he wondered. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at her, his gaze calm. After a few seconds of silence, Mark responded in a calm voice, without anger, "I'm a first-class passenger. This is my ticket." But the flight attendant refused to yield. "This other passenger has priority," she said, emphasizing that Mark wasn't the only VIP in the cabin. That was the vague excuse she used to make Mark give up his seat. She was trying to deceive me. Mark looked around again. The other passengers, no one spoke up. They just glanced at him, seemingly too scared to say anything. The entire cabin was silent, only the sound of deep breaths hanging in the air. The coldness in the flight attendant's eyes began to make him feel suffocated. This was the kind of discrimination he was used to. It was the sharp looks he had always received whenever he stepped into places where he had to fight to belong. Suddenly, Mark couldn't stay silent anymore. The entire cabin went completely still when he stood up, abruptly took out his phone. He wasn't angry. There was no defeat in his eyes. Mark opened his camera and aimed it at the flight attendant, who was still standing there, looking at him as if he didn't belong. "What's going on?" he said, his voice calm, not rushing. "Who exactly am I supposed to give up my seat for?" The whole space fell silent. Then the flight attendant and those around her began to realize something was odd. It felt like Mark wasn't just a regular passenger. It felt like everything they had thought about him, about the confrontations they had prepared for, was suddenly evaporating in an instant. The turning point came quickly. She didn't realize it, but Mark Turner wasn't who they thought he was. He wasn't just a regular customer. He was the one who controlled this entire industry. Mark knew it was time to stop being silent. Not because he was angry, but because he understood that if he didn't stand up now, everything he had done would be overlooked. It wasn't just about a seat. It wasn't just about the petty discrimination. This was a silent war that Mark, with all his power in hand, couldn't avoid. Behind the first-class cabin in the shadows of the airport, the sounds continued. And in Mark's mind, a quiet plan was beginning to take shape. Today would be the day they remember him, not just for the discrimination they created, but because he was the one who would change everything. Mark stood there in the middle of the cabin, feeling as though everything around him was slowing down. The passengers surrounding him were all staring at him with strange looks, as if he were an intruder. The flight attendant remained there, her face pale from the unexpected reaction, but still refusing to admit her mistake. The entire cabin was silent, the tension rising with each passing second. A passenger behind him even reached out, as if to intervene, but dared not speak. Everyone felt the injustice, but no one dared to speak up. This silence was like an unconscious reaction, a passive complicity in a situation they all knew was wrong but felt powerless to change. Mark didn't take his eyes off the flight attendant, sensing the confusion and fear spreading in the air. He took a deep breath, calm, no trace of anger in his demeanor. He was used to these moments, the times when he was underestimated, dismissed simply because of his skin color. But this time, he couldn't stay silent anymore. "This is my ticket," Mark repeated once more, his voice gentle but firm. "And I will not give up this seat for anyone." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, staring at him. His words were not just a claim to his rights, but a declaration from someone no longer afraid of the misguided judgments of those around him. The flight attendant still said nothing. She looked at him, then glanced back at the other passengers, her eyes filled with worry. No one could have expected that the person they had dismissed as unworthy would be the one to send the entire airline system into turmoil. Mark could feel the shift in the atmosphere. He didn't need to shout or argue, because he knew that power didn't come just from words, it came from actions. And his action today, even if it was just sitting there, was enough to make those around him take notice. He knew that today wasn't just about a first-class seat. It was about sending a powerful message. Never judge a person based on their appearance. The scene unfolded quickly. A new voice rang out from the back of the cabin. It was Captain Reynolds. He walked over with confidence, but there was a noticeable tension in his eyes. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his tone professional, but unable to hide his concern. Mark didn't respond immediately. He looked into Captain Reynolds's eyes, not with fear, but with calm and determination. "Nothing, I'm just sitting in my assigned seat." He emphasized each word, like a warning to the crew that he was not someone who could be easily pushed around. Captain Reynolds paused, as if looking for a way to resolve the situation without making a scene. But after a few seconds, he sighed, lowered his voice, and said, "All right, but we need you to give up your seat for another passenger." He still didn't understand that Mark Turner was not someone he could simply give orders to. Mark didn't answer immediately. He knew that now wasn't the time to argue. He sensed the confusion in the minds of those around him, still thinking that he was just an ordinary man with no power. But when they hear his name, when they realize who Mark Turner is, everything will change. He stood up slowly, taking out his phone. The entire cabin froze, all eyes turning to him. He pointed his phone at the flight attendant, capturing the entire scene. Not because he wanted to cause a scene, but to document it, so everyone could see the injustice clearly. "If I'm going to be removed from this seat, I want to make sure someone is held responsible for this," he said, his voice steady. The flight attendant remained silent, but in her eyes he saw confusion and regret. Mark Turner had flipped the situation on its head, not with anger or arguments, but with an unwavering determination. He had drawn a clear line between true power and subtle discrimination. Captain Reynolds stepped back, unsure of what to do next. He looked at his colleagues, not daring to intervene further. And at that moment, the passengers around began whispering, paying more attention to what was unfolding. No one dared to speak out, but everyone could feel the change in the air. Mark sat back down, still calm, his gaze unwavering. The passengers around him began to realize that this wasn't just a confrontation between him and the crew. This was a message they could not ignore. Mark Turner was not an ordinary man. He was the one who controlled the fate of the aviation industry, and in that moment he had used his power to make everyone around him face the truth. The silence spread, but it wasn't fear. It was an unspoken challenge, a declaration discrimination would never have a place when people like Mark Turner stand up. The sound of Captain Reynolds's footsteps echoed clearly across the airplane floor, but no one could hear it anymore. Everyone was drawn into the tension between him and Mark. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, all eyes fixed on him. No one spoke, but everyone could feel the change in the air. Captain Reynolds stood there for a moment, then turned to look at the flight attendant. She shook her head, as if unsure of what to do. Mark Turner had completely turned everything upside down. He was not someone who could be removed from his seat just because of a simple request. He was the one controlling the airline system that those around him had no idea about. A single glance from flight attendant Bethany was enough to make Mark feel as though she were mocking him. She tried to hide her frustration, but the tension in the air couldn't be concealed. In that moment, everyone realized that not only had Mark been underestimated, but these people didn't even understand who he was. Mark could sense the surprise slowly spreading across the faces of those around him. At that moment, he was not just a passenger facing discrimination. He was the only one who could change everything. The next scene unfolded quickly. The sound of the airport manager's footsteps and security personnel echoed across the floor. A man walked in his steps, quick and confident, his outfit impeccably neat. He looked at Captain Reynolds, then at flight attendant Bethany. His words were calm, but no one could deny the power in his voice. "You'll have to explain this," he said, looking at those present. "This passenger cannot be treated like an ordinary person." Flight attendant. Bethany stared at him, unable to respond immediately. By now, Mark had completely taken control of the conversation. The entire space seemed to quiet down for a beat. Clearly, Mark Turner was not someone who could be deceived by shallow excuses. He had the power to demand anything, and in that moment he wanted to wield that power strongly, not just to protect his rights, but to teach everyone around him that discrimination would not have a place in his world. "This excuse won't pass," he said, decisively. He wasn't just a passenger fighting for his rights. He was the CEO of Flytech Solutions, with the power to change the entire aviation industry. He raised his hand not to criticize or protest, but to show that he had nothing to fear. He stood firm, his gaze unwavering. "You have the authority to handle this situation," Mark said, "but I also have the right to be respected, and I demand you handle this properly." His words were gentle, but like an undeniable statement, a reminder of his power. Flight attendant Bethany lowered her head, her eyes filled with surprise. She couldn't help but feel ashamed when she realized she had mistaken an ordinary person for someone without power. Now she knew Mark was not a regular passenger. He was someone who could overturn an entire industry. "Thank you, Mark," continued his voice, softening but still filled with determination. "Now I'll return to my seat." He sat back down, looking at the seat he had purchased with his money and power, not because he wanted to show off, but because it was his right. And no matter who had intentions of stopping him in that moment, Mark Turner had made the entire cabin silent, because they all realized that he was not an ordinary man. But the surprise didn't only come from Mark. It came from those around him. The passengers who had once stood by, watching now, couldn't turn a blind eye to the truth. They started to ask themselves, "Are we the outsiders in this battle?" A feeling of surprise and shame grew in everyone. They began to realize that what Mark was doing wasn't just about reclaiming a seat, but a battle against discrimination, and those who thought power belonged to them, simply because they could judge others. Mark sat there, not in a rush, not angry, just silently and calmly. He knew that today he wasn't just standing up for his rights. He was the one creating a turning point, the one who would change the entire system. In the cabin, all eyes were still on him, but now no one dared to look at him as an anonymous passenger anymore. Mark Turner had shown them that true power wasn't always visible on the outside. Real power came from confidence, from standing up to protect one's values, not from the biased looks of others. Mark Turner was not just the one who was discriminated against. He was the one who would make the world reassess fairness and power in a society where people are often judged by their appearance. And he knew that after today, no one would look at him as a man without power again. The cabin was silent. The air was thick, heavy, as if the entire space had come to a standstill, waiting for a final decision. All eyes were on Mark Turner, the man who had just stood up and confidently asserted his rights in an undeniable way. Flight attendant Bethany Carter stood there, her hands clenched, her face pale, as she realized she had just made a serious mistake. In contrast to her earlier arrogance, now she was left with nothing but confusion. Mark was not an ordinary passenger, not someone who could be easily judged and dismissed. He was a man with power. A moment later, the sound of footsteps echoed from the end of the cabin. Captain Reynolds appeared, his eyes narrowing when he saw the situation, but he still maintained a calm demeanor, as though handling a minor issue. However, the atmosphere in the cabin had completely changed, no longer the professionalism he had wanted to maintain. People began to realize this was no longer a simple matter. "What's going on?" Captain Reynolds asked, but his voice was vague. He wasn't sure, and that was the weakness Mark immediately noticed. Mark looked at him, his eyes alert but full of challenge. He sat up straight, facing those who were trying to impose their power on him. "I've said it already, I'm sitting in my rightful seat, and I'm not giving it up for anyone." His voice rang out, not loud, but clear enough for everyone to hear and impossible to ignore. No one dared to respond. Not because they didn't want to, but because they had realized Mark Turner was not someone they could easily dismiss. He didn't need to make a scene. He just needed to stand firm and maintain his calm, for that was the most powerful weapon he had. The entire cabin froze. Flight attendant Bethany didn't dare say anything else, her eyes now filled with fear and confusion. Captain Reynolds stood still, seemingly unsure of what to do next. But in that moment, Mark knew that the battle wasn't with them, but with the entire system that had been built to look down on people like him. Mark didn't feel anger. He didn't feel that burning fury rising in his chest like before when he faced discrimination. He had learned how to face these moments without letting emotions take control. He was used to the prejudice and mockery. But today, what he wanted to prove wasn't about the rights of an individual. He wanted to prove the strength of perseverance and the power of standing firm. A second later, Mark opened his phone, not to take a picture but to document the entire incident. He didn't need to make a fuss. He just needed to prove this injustice with evidence. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said, his voice still gentle but full of confidence. "I'm just asking for my rights, just like any other passenger." He repeated this as a declaration, not needing anyone's approval, not needing to explain further. The cabin was no longer silent. The passengers' gazes shifted from curiosity to awareness. They no longer saw him as an anonymous person, but as someone with great influence in the aviation industry. Those who had previously glanced at Mark now looked at him differently, as if they were starting to recognize the truth they had been avoiding. But just then, another voice rang out. Not from Captain Reynolds, but from a man standing at the end of the cabin, a man dressed in a sharp suit with the air of a senior manager. He walked quickly toward them, but this time not to support the situation, but to stand by Mark. "I'm responsible for the airline's operations," the man said, his voice firm and clear. "I can't let this situation continue. Thank you for documenting this." This was an unexpected turn of events. Mark immediately realized that this man was not an ordinary employee. He was someone influential in the company, someone who understood that Mark was not someone to be deceived by unreasonable excuses. He looked directly at the attendants, not giving them a chance to justify themselves, and suddenly everything changed. A moment of silence passed. The man took out his phone, then said something no one dared to stop. "This is an executive matter. Let me handle it." And in that moment, Mark realized that he hadn't just won in a personal confrontation, he had begun winning against the entire system. Mark stood up, not in a rush, not making a fuss, but walking with confidence and certainty. He returned to his seat, not looking back. He had done what he needed to do, and in his heart there was a strange calm. He knew that today would be a day the aviation industry would never forget. A sense of peace spread within him. Finally, he had truly turned the tables. Mark sat back in his seat, glancing at the airplane screen, but not to continue the work he had left unfinished. A strange feeling, an unusual calm spread through him. He still hadn't said everything he needed to, but today's actions carried more power than words ever could. He knew they would never see him as an anonymous passenger again. But the story didn't end there. Flight attendant Bethany Carter, Her hands, still trembling, took a small step back. Her eyes filled with both surprise and confusion. She never imagined that a first-class passenger, someone just wanting to travel like everyone else, could bring about such a profound change. The entire cabin remained silent, but this silence wasn't fear. It was a new awareness of power and fairness. The passengers around him now understood. Mark Turner was not someone who could be underestimated, and deep down they all realized that Mark had fought not just for his own rights, but for the other passengers, those who had endured the discrimination he had faced. A chime signaling the airplane's descent rang out in the cabin. The journey continued, but for Mark, everything had changed. A sense of calm washed over him, but it was also the determination that remained unwavering. He looked out the window, watching the clouds float by, and knew he would never forget this moment, the moment he not only proved his own power, but opened the door to a new era. As the plane prepared to land, another voice came through the cabin. Captain Reynolds entered once more, but this time he no longer wore the stern expression he had earlier. He walked over to Mark, his gaze different, no longer filled with doubt or contempt like it was at the beginning. "Thank you for your patience," Captain Reynolds said truly, looking at Mark not just as a passenger, but as someone who had brought about a significant change. "I understand we were wrong." Mark looked at him indifferently, but inside a small sense of satisfaction grew. It wasn't revenge, but recognition and real change. He didn't need an apology, but he wanted to know that this kind of discrimination would no longer exist. The plane landed, and Mark stepped out, feeling the soft warmth of the sunlight from outside. Everything was still going on as usual, but he had changed it. An unexpected sense of satisfaction spread through him. As for flight attendant Bethany, she couldn't forget the look in Mark's eyes. A feeling of regret began to rise in her, not just because of what she had done, but because she realized she had been wrong. But people like her, those who unknowingly become enforcers of discrimination, need to learn to see others with respect. Mark Turner had just taught her that lesson. Mark returned to his hotel room, where he could finally relax. But inside, a real battle was just beginning. He looked at his phone, receiving numerous calls from partners, friends, and colleagues. They asked about the incident on the plane, about what he had done. "Thank you for fighting," a colleague said over the phone. "You did what none of us had the courage to do." Mark smiled gently. He hadn't done it for himself. He did it for all those who had been overlooked, for those judged because of their skin color or status. In a quiet moment, looking out the window, Mark thought about the battles to come. He knew life would never be easy, and there would be many challenges ahead. But he also knew that his determination would bring about great change. He had started as an ordinary passenger, but now he was the one standing firm and making change in an industry full of power and discrimination. Today he wasn't just a successful CEO, he was a symbol of change of power born from fairness. Mark Turner hadn't just defeated racism on a flight, he had defeated an entire system that had always tried to overlook people like him. It was a victory not just for him, but for anyone brave enough to stand up and demand the respect they deserved. The next morning, Mark woke up in his hotel room with a sense of reality settling in, knowing he was no longer an anonymous figure. Everything seemed stable, but he knew that the real battle had just begun. Suddenly, he realized that today would be the day the entire aviation industry would face the consequences of the discrimination they had maintained for far too long. He picked up his phone, still with notifications and missed calls from partners and colleagues in the company. But at that moment, Mark didn't feel excitement or joy from victory. There was a deeper reason inside him. He had to act to truly change the world. The aviation industry and many other sectors could no longer continue this way, constantly judging and discriminating based on skin color or status. At Flytech Solutions headquarters, Mark's team was preparing for an important meeting. Everyone in the office knew about the events from the day before. They didn't just see it as a personal event for Mark, but as a powerful message sent to the entire industry. Mark entered the meeting room, his expression calm, but his eyes full of determination. He didn't need to speak immediately. Everyone in the room already knew what he wanted. After yesterday's event, Mark was no longer just seen as an ordinary CEO, but as a symbol of change. "What do we do next?" Vanessa Taylor, the legal director, spoke up. She stood her gaze quiet, but sharp. "This is our opportunity to truly make a difference." Mark didn't rush to respond. He looked around the room, feeling the supportive and empathetic looks from everyone. He knew they would stand by him, because he wasn't just fighting for his own rights, but for those without a voice. "We're going to take 3 major steps," Mark began, his voice firm and resolute. "The first step is to make this known widely. We won't stay silent about discrimination. We will provide clear evidence and show the world that justice must be served." Mark paused, his gaze sweeping over the people in the room. "The second step, we will use the strength of our company to weaken these airlines. I will make an announcement to our partners to cut ties with any company that supports racism." He took a deep breath, his voice growing sharper. "And the final step, we will make them pay fairly, not just by firing a few people. I want them to change from the roots to face the consequences of their discriminatory actions." Vanessa and the executives in the room exchanged glances, their eyes full of determination and support. This was no longer Mark's personal fight, but a battle for fairness. A battle in which Flytech Solutions was no longer just a leading software company, but a symbol of change in the aviation industry. "What do we do when they try to distract us?" Richard Dawson, the chief operating officer, asked. His question was challenging, but Mark knew that Richard always thought ahead and strategically. "We won't let them," Mark replied. "We will stand firm and use our own power to change the rules." Mark looked out the window where the sunlight began to shine through the tall buildings. A vast city full of opportunities and challenges. He couldn't just stand by and wait for change. He had to be the one to start it. The world couldn't continue like this. He silently told himself, today will be the day they face real change. When he turned back to the meeting room, everything was ready. Flytech Solutions would no longer just be a software company. We would be the pioneers of a new industrial revolution. After the meeting ended, Mark stepped out of the room feeling a renewed energy within him. He knew he had to act quickly before it was too late. Now, racial discrimination in the aviation industry would no longer have a place, and he would be the one to make them change. On his way out of the headquarters, Mark received a call from Amara, his wife. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Mark smiled gently. "You'll be proud of me," Amara, Mark said. "I'm changing the entire system." "I believe in you," Amara replied, her voice calm but full of trust. "You've always stood up for what's right." Mark ended the call and stepped outside, feeling the light breeze on his face, like a sign of the good things to come. He knew that the biggest fight of his life had just begun. and no one could stop him. Today he would not only create change in the aviation industry, but he would change the entire system, a world where everyone has the right to be treated fairly regardless of skin color status or power. With unwavering determination, Mark Turner had begun his journey to create a new world, one where justice was served and discrimination could no longer exist. The next day, Flytech Solutions began taking the first steps in the three-phase strategy Mark had outlined. His first moves were not vague promises, but concrete actions full of power. He knew that if he wanted to change the system, he had to use his own power to create a real shock. In the meeting room at Flytech, Mark and his team were preparing for the first step of the strategy, putting immense pressure on the 3 airlines that had violated the fundamental principles of fairness. Vanessa Taylor and Richard Dawson were ready for the legal battle, while James Robertson, the marketing director, was preparing a powerful media campaign. Mark stood before them, his gaze not only fixed on the future, but also on the past of discrimination he had endured. This wasn't just about a first-class seat. This was a battle to reclaim justice for all those who had been treated unfairly. The first step we need to create a public outcry, Mark said, his voice strong and decisive. These airlines think they can overlook racism because we remain silent. But we won't stay silent. Let's show them that we have the power and we won't forgive this injustice. Vanessa nodded. We'll launch the media campaign today. All the information will be widely disseminated, not just within the industry, but out to the community. The images from the plane incident will be undeniable evidence. Richard, looking confident, added, We'll start with strong responses from customers, especially those who witnessed the incident. For these 3 airlines, they can't just offer a trivial apology. We will make them accountable. Mark smiled, but not because he was satisfied with the plan. He smiled because he knew this battle would change the aviation industry forever. He could clearly sense that everyone was ready to stand up and break the so-called silence of power. Throughout the day, the media campaign was aggressively launched. Video clips showing him being pulled from the first-class seat spread across social platforms. People no longer saw him as a passenger discriminated against, but as a symbol of the fight for justice. Messages about the power of justice and fairness were shared widely, and the media system quickly became involved in this battle. Not only that, partners and competitors of the 3 airlines began to notice the change. The legal actions Mark and his team were preparing made the shareholders and executives of these airlines rethink their policies. The next day, Mark received a call from the CEO of one of the 3 major airlines. The conversation with him was no longer a simple dialogue between a customer and a service company. It was a conversation between a powerful individual and a system that had hidden the truth. Mr. Turner, I want to apologize for what happened. We deeply regret it and are committed to improving our services immediately. Mark chuckled softly, not because he found the apology valuable, but because he knew these apologies couldn't fix anything. He replied calmly, An apology means nothing to me without action to back it up. I don't need an apology. I need to see change. The conversation ended quickly, and from then on Mark began to notice that everyone in the aviation industry had changed their perception of power. Mark Turner was no longer someone to be looked down upon. He was the one in control. On the 3rd day, the crisis in the aviation industry began to escalate. The 3 major airlines were forced to make significant reforms under pressure from public opinion and the media. Official investigations from regulatory authorities began, and the results weren't looking good for them. The change didn't just come from Mark's struggle, but from those who had dared to stand up and take on the challenge. They no longer feared being ostracized, no longer feared losing their place in a system that thrived on injustice. Mark knew that justice would never come easily. He still received calls from partners asking him to calm things down. But inside he felt no wavering. He understood that his career wasn't just about personal success, but the key to unlocking a new era where every passenger would be respected. He sat at his desk, looking out the window where the sunlight was beginning to shine. Nothing could stop him now. His next step wasn't about personal victory, it was about the victory of justice in a world that was changing every day. Mark Turner was no longer just a CEO. He was a symbol of change, and the world would remember him as someone who didn't just stand up for himself, but for everyone who had been discriminated against, everyone who had been overlooked, and those who lacked the power to speak the truth. The next day, Mark woke up with a feeling that there was no turning back. He knew that once the door to change was opened, there was no way to close it. Everything around him seemed to move slower. He felt the stillness fill the hotel room like a sign of the profound change that was about to take place. The tension in the aviation industry had not subsided. On the contrary, it was escalating. The video of the incident on the plane had quickly gone viral on social media, attracting the attention of the world. Airlines could no longer dismiss the criticisms from the public. The stories of racism that Mark had exposed had sparked a strong wave of protest. Mark stood by the window, looking out at the first light of dawn lighting up the city. He sighed, feeling the weight of the days ahead. No one thought they would be here, not as a great man, but as someone who dared to stand up for what was right. He knew that what he did today wouldn't just affect one industry, but would challenge an entire system that had existed for centuries. Meanwhile, outside of Flytech Solutions' world, the three major airlines were starting to face serious decisions from regulatory authorities. The crisis was deepening, and no one could predict how it would end. That morning, an intense meeting was held between the executives of the three airlines and industry leaders. It was an emergency session. The executives had received a fierce wave of criticism, and they couldn't help but worry about their company's future. Not because of financial losses, but because they were beginning to realize the shortcomings in how they managed their staff, their customers, and the diversity within their companies. Meanwhile, Mark didn't miss the opportunity. He had an important call with Lisa Warren, the new CEO of one of the major airlines, who had previously been dodging questions from the media and authorities. "Mark, I know things have gone further than expected," Lisa said when she answered the call. Her voice was filled with worry and fatigue, but there was also a clear determination. "We can't continue like this. My actions yesterday weren't enough to fix what happened." Mark knew that Lisa was trying her best, but her fear wasn't enough to prevent the collapse of an empire that had been standing for so long. He smiled softly over the phone. "We need to do more than that. Thank you for recognizing the issue. But now it can't just be words. We will face the consequences, not just from the public, but from our shareholders. These changes can't be delayed any longer," Lisa replied, her voice tinged with sadness, but also firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure what you've asked for gets implemented." Mark hung up the phone and leaned back, reflecting on what he had done, on the changes he had set in motion. He was no longer simply fighting for his own rights. He had embarked on a battle where every step he took opened a door to irreversible change. The people around him were starting to understand that he was not just a CEO, but a symbol of justice in a system that had become outdated and discriminatory. The next morning, Mark woke up prepared for an important meeting with the representatives of the airlines he had demanded to meet in person. This would not just be a meeting to negotiate, but also a final opportunity for these airlines to change. He had prepared meticulously, not just legally, but with solid evidence. As he entered the meeting room, the light from the window came in, and Mark could feel the tension in the air. The people in the room began to realize that their decisions could no longer be as simple as before. Mark Turner was no longer someone they could easily disregard. He wasn't there to ask for small changes. He was there to ensure that the company would face real change. The meeting began. The executives of the 3 airlines sat across from Mark. No more fake smiles, no more hollow apologies. Now they realized that Mark Turner was not just a man with financial power, but someone who would make them change. He looked at each person in the room, not needing to raise his voice or shout. He only needed to use his calmness and decisiveness to make them reconsider. "We won't stop at an apology," Mark began, his voice gentle but firm. "I want to see concrete actions. Those actions cannot be light punishments for a few employees. There needs to be a major change, a change from the roots." The people in the room said nothing, only listening in silence. They knew that there was no way to adjust the issue easily now. Justice wasn't something that could be bought with an apology. It had to be executed through strong action. Mark Turner knew that this battle had just begun, but he also knew that once it had started, he wouldn't stop until he achieved what he wanted. Justice had to be served not just in the aviation industry, but in all other industries where power was still being abused. The battle would continue. The next day, Mark woke up with the feeling that there was no turning back. He knew that once the door to change was opened, it couldn't be closed. Everything around him seemed to move slower. He felt a stillness fill the hotel room, like a sign of the profound change about to unfold. The tension in the aviation industry hadn't subsided. On the contrary, it was escalating. The video of the incident on the plane quickly spread across social media, attracting global attention. The airlines could no longer ignore the criticism from the public. The stories of racism Mark had exposed sparked a strong wave of protest. Mark stood by the window watching the first light of dawn illuminate the city. He sighed, feeling the weight of the days ahead. No one ever thought they'd be here, not as a great man, but as someone who dared to stand up for what was right. He knew that what he was doing today would not only affect one industry, but would challenge an entire system that had existed for centuries. Meanwhile, outside the world of flytech solutions, the 3 major airlines were starting to face serious decisions from regulatory authorities. The crisis was deepening, and no one could predict how it would end. That morning, an intense meeting took place between the executives of the 3 airlines and industry leaders. It was an emergency session. The executives had received a fierce wave of criticism, and they couldn't help but worry about their company's future. Not because of financial losses, but because they were beginning to realize the shortcomings in how they managed their staff, their customers, and the diversity within their companies. Meanwhile, Mark didn't miss the opportunity. He had an important call with Lisa Warren, the new CEO of one of the major airlines, who had previously been dodging questions from the media and authorities. "Mark, I know things have gone further than expected," Lisa said when she answered the call. Her voice was filled with worry and fatigue, but there was also clear determination. "We can't continue like this. My actions yesterday weren't enough to fix what happened." Mark knew that Lisa was trying her best, but her fear wasn't enough to stop the collapse of an empire that had been standing for so long. He smiled softly over the phone. "We need to do more than that. Thank you for recognizing the issue. But now it can't just be words. We'll face the consequences, not just from the public, but from our shareholders. These changes can't be delayed any longer." Lisa replied, her voice tinged with sadness, but also firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure what you've asked for gets implemented." Mark hung up the phone and leaned back, reflecting on what he had done, on the changes he had set in motion. He was no longer simply fighting for his own rights. He had embarked on a battle where every step he took opened a door to irreversible change. The people around him were starting to understand that he was not just a CEO, but a symbol of justice in a system that had become outdated and discriminatory. The next morning, Mark woke up prepared for an important meeting with the representatives of the airlines he had demanded to meet in person. This wouldn't just be a meeting to negotiate, but also a final opportunity for these airlines to change. He had prepared meticulously, not just legally, but with solid evidence. As he entered the meeting room, the light from the window streamed in, and Mark could feel the tension in the air. The people in the room began to realize that their decisions could no longer be as simple as before. Mark Turner was no longer someone they could easily disregard. He wasn't there to ask for small changes. He was there to ensure that the company would face real change. The meeting began. The executives of the three airlines sat across from Mark. No more fake smiles. No more hollow apologies. Now they realized that Mark Turner was not just a man with financial power, but someone who would make them change. He looked at each person in the room, not needing to raise his voice or shout. He only needed to use his calmness and decisiveness to make them reconsider. "We won't stop at an apology," Mark began, his voice gentle but firm. "I want to see concrete actions. Those actions cannot be light punishments for a few employees. There needs to be a major change, a change from the roots." The people in the room said nothing, only listening in silence. They knew that there was no way to adjust the issue easily now. Justice wasn't something that could be bought with an apology. It had to be executed through strong action. Mark Turner knew that this battle had just begun, but he also knew that once it had started, he wouldn't stop until he achieved what he wanted. Justice had to be served, not just in the aviation industry, but in all other industries where power was still being abused. The battle would continue. A month passed, and the aviation industry had never changed so quickly. The airlines Mark had criticized were now facing a media storm and intense public backlash. Flytech Solutions was no longer just a software company, but the leader in the fight against racism in the aviation industry. Mark felt the power of the decisions he had made, but he also knew a bigger battle lay ahead. He still clearly remembered Amara's words when she asked, "What will you do next?" Her question wasn't about his next work plans, but about the price he would have to pay for the major decisions he was making. Mark knew this battle wouldn't just be filled with anonymous victories, but would also come with sacrifices. That morning, Mark received an unexpected call from the authorities. This call wasn't to invite him into a light discussion on potential solutions, but a call demanding that Mark and Flytech Solutions face an official investigation into the impact of the company on the airlines they served. Mr. Turner, we would like to clarify a few points regarding Flytech Solutions' influence on these airlines. The voice of the investigator was calm, but sharp enough to make Mark feel the immediate tension. Mark paused, took a sip of coffee, and then took a deep breath. He knew the fight wasn't over, and now everything wasn't just about fairness, but about the ability to wield his power correctly. "All right," Mark replied. "We'll meet, but I won't compromise." He knew this was a pivotal moment. This was the final confrontation he couldn't avoid. That day, Mark didn't go to the office. Instead, he went somewhere else, a place the aviation industry and the authorities hadn't expected. He wanted to prove that this fight wouldn't just happen in meetings or investigations, but would be carried out through concrete and powerful actions. Mark went to the headquarters of a major airline where they were holding an emergency meeting with key leaders. In this meeting, the press and regulatory agencies would be present to observe and record every word, and Mark had decided to stand before them, not as someone being ostracized, but as a man with power and the ability to enforce justice. During the meeting, when the CEO of the airline began offering apologies and commitments to change, Mark couldn't sit still. He stood up, placed his hand on the table, and looked directly at those sitting before him. "These apologies mean nothing without accompanying action," Mark said, his voice deepening. "You were wrong, and you must take responsibility. I demand immediate changes." "Why should we change?" one of the senior executives asked, his tone somewhat challenging. "Is it really too late, Mark? Didn't he citate?" He responded with a certainty no one could challenge. "Because if you don't change, I will do everything I can to make you realize that discrimination cannot exist in a modern industry. And I will start right now." The atmosphere in the room became heavy, and everyone understood that Mark Turner wasn't just speaking empty words. He had proven that through his actions. A turning point came immediately after. The airline executives had no choice but to accept responsibility and commit to action. They could no longer handle this situation with empty words. They had to take concrete measures. Mark knew that his actions had far-reaching effects, not just in the aviation industry, but in other industries where power and discrimination still existed behind the scenes. He had changed the aviation industry forever, and now he would continue fighting to ensure that no other field would have a place for this kind of discrimination. Mark returned to his office, feeling a sense of certainty in each step he took. He didn't feel tired, even though the battle was far from over. He understood that every step he took would not only change the world, but would create something irreversible. This fight wasn't just for Mark Turner, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And when Mark looked out the window, he didn't just see the city ahead, but a world he was slowly rebuilding. The price to pay might be great, but the power to change everything was now in his hands. And now he was the one rewriting the rules of the game. When Mark Turner stood up against discrimination, he wasn't just defending his personal rights, but became a symbol for those who dare to fight for justice. What he didn't just change the way we perceive power, but also served as a profound lesson in how perseverance and determination can overturn an entire system. Mark's story shows us that sometimes justice doesn't come from gentle conversations or easy forgiveness, but from firm and decisive actions. It is his steadfastness in the face of adversity and refusal to accept injustice that helped him overcome it all, creating change not just for himself, but for an entire industry. Mark didn't just change the aviation industry, He opened a door for those who will follow, for all of us, ensuring no one is underestimated because of their skin color or background. So what about you? Have you ever faced discrimination in your life or work? Leave your thoughts in the comments and share your story. Comment justice if you believe that justice will always prevail. If you feel inspired by this story and it changes the way you view power and fairness, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss more stories like this in the future. Thank you for watching, and remember, every action we take has the power to change the world.